When you walk through the Virginia Beach Boardwalk and walk down that concrete through the 20th century, you also take a little walk right through the American economy. And we're going to spend a little bit of time today on this episode of This Cool Museum and look at that economic development that happened right here on the Virginia Beach Boardwalk. Virginia Beach is a vision of railroad investors. Remember, the railroad was already here. They were at the Port of Virginia in Norfolk. All of that cargo trade that was coming in out of the Chesapeake Bay, the railroad was moving those goods in and out of those cargoes, all through America. Those investors looked down the strip of sand that we take for granted today and envisioned a new kind of economy, tourism. And in 1883, the railroaders built the first hotel, Virginia Beach. And it was the Virginia Beach Hotel. And it had 90 rooms and electrification. It was a very modern facility for its time. It gets enlarged in 1887. New towers are put on, and it also changes the name to the Princess Anne. You almost always see the photographs and the images of this building referred to as the Princess Anne Hotel. What the railroad also does is two more things. Number one, they build a boardwalk. It ran right in this area, which is today our 16th Street area. The railroad station was just a block away at 17th Street. And they built this boardwalk. It ran all the way to about from 16th to what we would call about 12th Street today. And they also looked at the land above the Princess Anne Hotel and they parceled it. And they began to sublet or sell that land, actually, the little parcels along the oceanfront, to locals investors. And that's what starts to build the early cottage line that we see accompany the first hotel. Like many buildings of its time in the day, the Princess Anne, the great wooden hotel, burned. And that was in 1907, and it actually took a chunk of the boardwalk with it. But by no means did it bring an end to the idea of tourism in Virginia Beach. It was just getting started. By the time this hotel burned, already you had about 150,000 people a year that the railroad was bringing to the oceanfront. So even with the grand Princess Anne gone, Virginia Beach begins to boom as a tourist destination in the teens and in the 1920s. Large investment comes in both from the railroad and from individual investors to start to build the boardwalk up. One of our favorite photographs of the period, it's right around 1912 in an area that was built called Seaside Park. And this is kind of where the King Neptune statue stands today. You see the massive restaurants and all of the walkway and the greenery and the seawall and the promenade. And we can go further down and discover something at the Grove's new bathhouse. And that actually advertised saltwater swimming. In the teens, they installed saltwater swimming pools, and we have some really great photographs of those swimming pools right on the boardwalk, right at the oceanfront that visitors could enjoy. So people kept on coming, and investment followed. And the big addition that happened to the promenade, to the oceanfront in the 1920s was the Concrete Boardwalk, where a lot of seaside towns like this one started with wood. A lot of them kept wooden boardwalks. Ours went to concrete. That was an economic choice. A lot of places like Atlantic City were simply deciding to let the wooden walkway wash away in storms, and they would rebuild it. They're actually still doing that today. Investors here decided on a concrete seawall. And that decision from the 1920s is still the philosophy that marks how the Virginia Beach promenade looks when you're walking along the oceanfront. So all of this development booms through the 1920s. And Virginia Beach was a real center destination for tourism for people all through the Mid-Atlantic region. 1927, the Cavalier Hotel. And it's really at the height of the Roaring 20s. And it was pretty easy to see when you look at the photographs of the 1920s that it certainly was roaring in Virginia Beach. A lot of folks see the Cavalier as a beginning. And if you look at it economically, historically, the Cavalier really marks the end of an era. Now, the hotel did have a heyday from the time it's built in the 1920s all the way through the 30s into World War II. Remember, when I talk about this booming through the 1930s, we are in the American Depression. But when we see photographs of Virginia Beach through the 1930s, through that Depression era, we don't see people suffering. That's because of the clientele that was coming to the beach. And they've been coming to the beach. People with money have been coming to Virginia Beach since the 1880s. And they still flourished through the 1930s. And this was also, let's remember, Prohibition. Prohibition was not a time of hardship in Virginia Beach. You could get alcohol along the oceanfront. It wasn't that hard to find. Another reason when we look at all that period from 1925 all the way into the wartime era, we see good times in Virginia Beach. And in the 1940s, of course, the world explodes in World War II. And the economy at the Virginia Beach oceanfront changes entirely as Hampton Roads becomes a military town. The Navy, of course, was already here. They'd been here for a lot of decades, but the Navy and the shipyard began to expand very rapidly in response to the war. Over 60,000 men and women came through the Hampton Roads area just in the first 6 months. Hundreds of thousands of them would follow as they came through Hampton Roads in temporary positions, temporary housing, until they moved on to theaters of war. The cottage line tried to respond. All the cottages tried to fit and house all the sailors and the soldiers making that transition. There just wasn't enough. There was never enough rooms in Virginia Beach during World War II. And it's something that you saw the cottages add little additions and annexes. The Cavalier, of course, the one big hotel, was taken over by the United States Navy. Most importantly, the economy would stay military. What happened in World War II, this transition from a small coastal beach town to a military town, happens through the 1940s. And we are still that military town. We are still in the economy that was created by World War II. And like the whole country, Virginia Beach would change after the war. All of those military members come home. The war ends and the economy once again changes. The government makes a huge investment in our World War II heroes with the GI Bill, helps them with education, helps them with housing, and an entire middle class of America stands up now and really has a different kind of wealth to spend. And Virginia Beach answers immediately by reaching out to that wealth. And now you see the Virginia Beach oceanfront become about attracting the middle class visitor. And those hotels would start to pop up alongside the cottage line that still dominated what we would call the oceanfront. But these small hotels, these little granite hotels, a lot of them cinder block built, start to pop up along the oceanfront. New names, a new kind of character starts to develop in Virginia Beach in the 1950s as an answer to that huge shift in the American economy, with all of those people from World War II now home and back in the economic engine. The Thunderbird, the Royal Clipper, the Ocean Ranch, the Belvedere, the architecture and the names and the look of the oceanfront changed dramatically through the 1960s. This is the modern age developing. I mean, remember, this is the age of media. When we think of the 1960s, you think of TV. And the other thing that happens in the 60s is that exportation of the classic California beach culture. It's time for Frankie and Annette and bikinis and everything that we recognize as beach culture today gets born through the media and through the marketing of the 1960s. Virginia Beach answers with a whole new look. All of the architecture starts to change. A lot of that cottage line rapidly disappears now as these bigger hotels, these bigger privately owned hotels, respond to the massive tourism industry of the 1960s. This is an oceanfront that's now gone from thousands to tens of thousands, but in the 1960s there are millions of people coming here and the economy shifts to respond to it. And Virginia Beach has so much success through the 1960s. So much money begins to pour into tourism. The 1970s invites corporations. When I was a kid, you grew up and you had a choice. You could stay in a corporate hotel. They had signs on them like Holiday Inn and Howard Johnson and Ramada and the Marriott. This was the 1970s corporations battling with your other choice, what my parents would call a mom and pop. Let's look for a mom and pop to stay in. So you had the small mom and pop hotels that flourished in the 1960s, and now they're battling with these giant corporations of the 1970s. That battle would continue all through the 70s until, as you get into the modern era of the 1980s, very few of those mom and pops could compete and survive because the tourism money became so big that the little 3- and 4-story hotels get torn down and the big high-rise hotels get put up. And we still see that transition happening in Virginia Beach today as more and more corporations push the smaller companies out because you just can't have enough hotel rooms. So as we walked through the history of the Virginia Beach Boardwalk in the 20th century, we also find ourselves walking right through the history of the American economy. The industry of tourism and travel, born in the 1800s all the way to the dawn of the 21st century. We find all of that history right on our own board.